Saint Augustine on the Most Holy Trinity, Book 15, Chapter 8 and following. Chapter 8, how the Apostle says that God is now seen by us through a glass. I know that wisdom is an incorporeal substance, and that it is the light by which those things are seen that are not seen by carnal eyes. And yet a man so great and so spiritual as Paul says, we see now through a glass in an enigma, but then face to face. 1 Corinthians 13:12. If we ask what and of what sort is this glass, this assuredly occurs to our minds, that in a glass nothing is discerned but an image. We have endeavored then so to do, in order that we might see in some way or other by this image which we are, him by whom we are made as by a glass. And this is intimated also in the words of the same apostle, but we with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are transformed into the same image from glory to glory, is even as by the Spirit of the Lord. 2 Corinthians 3:18. Beholding as in a glass, he has said, i.e., seeing by means of a glass, not looking from a watchtower, an ambiguity that does not exist in the Greek language, whence the apostolic epistles have rendered into Latin. For in Greek, a glass, in which the images of things are visible, is wholly distinct in the sound of the word also from a watchtower, from the height of which we command a more distant view. And it is quite plain that the apostle, in using the word speculantes in respect to the glory of the Lord, meant it to come from speculum, not from specula. But where he says we are transformed into the same image, he assuredly means to speak of the image of God, and by calling it the same, he means that very image which we see in the glass, because that same image is also the glory of the Lord, as he says elsewhere, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God. 1 Corinthians 9:7. A text already discussed in the 12th book. He means then by we are transformed, that we are changed from one form to another, and that we pass from a form that is obscure to a form that is bright, since the obscure form too is the image of God, and if an image, then assuredly also glory, in which we are created as men, being better than the other animals. For it is said of human nature in itself, the man ought not to cover his head because he is the image and glory of God. And this nature, being the most excellent among things created, is transformed from a form that is defaced into a form that is beautiful, when it is justified by its own Creator from ungodliness. Since even in ungodliness itself, the more the faultiness is to be condemned, the more certainly is the nature to be praised. And therefore he has added, from glory to glory, from the glory of creation to the glory of justification. Although these words from glory to glory may be understood also in other ways, from the glory of faith to the glory of sight, from the glory whereby we are sons of God, to the glory whereby we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. 1 John 3:2. But in that he has added, as from the Spirit of the Lord, he declares that the blessing of so desirable a transformation is conferred upon us by the grace of God. Chapter 9 of the term enigma and of tropical modes of speech. What has been said relates to the words of the Apostle that we see now through a glass, but whereas he has added in an enigma, the meaning of this addition is unknown to any who are unacquainted with the books that contain the doctrine of those modes of speech, which the Greeks call tropes, which Greek word we also use in Latin. For as we more commonly speak of schemata than of figures, so we more commonly speak of tropes than of modes. And it is a very difficult and uncommon thing to express the names of the several modes or tropes in Latin, so as to refer its appropriate name to each. And hence some Latin translators, through unwillingness to employ a Greek word where the Apostle says which things are an allegory, Galatians 4:24, have rendered it by a circumlocution, which things signify one thing by another. But there are several species of this definition of the generic term, must necessarily embrace also all its species, and hence, as every horse is an animal, but not every animal is a horse, so every enigma is an allegory, but every allegory is not an enigma. What then is an allegory but a trope, wherein one thing is understood from another, as in the Epistle to the Thessalonians? Let us not therefore sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they who sleep, sleep in the night, and they who are drunken in the night. But let us who are of the day be sober. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6-8. But this allegory is not an enigma, for here the meaning is patent to all but the very dull. But an enigma is, to explain it briefly, an obscure allegory, as e.g. the horseleech had 3 daughters. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 15. And other like instances. But when the Apostle spoke of an allegory, he does not find it in the words but in the fact. Since he has shown that the 2 testaments are to be understood by the 2 sons of Abraham, one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman, which was a thing not said but also done. And before this was explained, it was obscure, and accordingly such an allegory, which is the generic name, could be specifically called an enigma. But because it is not only those that are ignorant of the books that contain the doctrine of tropes who inquire the Apostle's meaning when he said that we see now in an enigma, but those too who are acquainted with the doctrine, but yet desire to know what that enigma is in which we now see, we must find a single meaning for the 2 phrases, viz., for that which says, we see now through a glass, and for that which adds in an enigma. For it makes but one sentence when the whole is so uttered, we see now through a glass in an enigma. Accordingly, as far as my judgment goes, as by the word glass he meant to signify an image, so by that of enigma any likeness you will, but yet one obscure and difficult to see through. Why, therefore, any likenesses, whatever may be understood as signified by the Apostle when he speaks of a glass and an enigma, so that they are adapted to the understanding of God in such way as he can be understood, yet nothing is better adapted to this purpose than that which is not vainly called his image. Let no one then wonder that we labor to see in any way at all, even in that fashion of seeing which is granted to us in this life, viz., through a glass in an enigma. For we should not hear of an enigma in this place if sight were easy. And this is a yet greater enigma, that we do not see what we can't but see. For who does not see his own thought? And yet, who does see his own thought, I do not say with eye of the flesh, but with the inner mind, but with the inner sight itself? Who does not see it, and who does see it? Since thought is a kind of sight of the mind, whether those things are present which are seen also by the bodily eye, or perceived by the other senses, or whether they are not present but their likenesses are discerned by thought, or whether neither of these is the case, but things are thought of that are neither bodily things nor likenesses of bodily things, as the virtue and vices, or as indeed thought itself is thought of, or whether it be those things which are the subjects of instruction and of liberal sciences, or whether the higher causes and reasons themselves of all these things in the unchangeable nature are thought of, or whether it be even evil and vain, and false things that we are thinking of, with either the sense not consenting or erring in its consent. Chapter 10, concerning the word of the mind, in which we see the word of God as in a glass and in an enigma. But let us now speak of those things of which we think as known, and have in our knowledge even if we do not think of them, whether they belong to the contemplative knowledge, which, as I have argued, is properly to be called wisdom, or to the active, which is properly to be called knowledge. For both together belong to one mind and are one image of God. But when we treat of the lower of the two distinctly and separately, then it is not to be called an image of God, although even then too some likeness of that Trinity may be found in it, as we showed in the 13th book. We speak now, therefore, of the entire knowledge of man altogether, in which whatever is known to us is known, that at any rate which is true, otherwise it would not be known. For no one knows what is false except when he knows it to be false. And if he knows this, then he knows what is true. For it is true that that is false. We treat therefore now of those things which we think as known, and which are known to us even if they are not being thought of. But certainly, if we would utter them in words, we can only do so by thinking them. For although there were no words spoken, at any rate, he who thinks speaks in his heart, and hence that passage in the book of wisdom, they said within themselves, thinking not right. Wisdom chapter 2 verse 1. For the words they said within themselves are explained by the addition of thinking. A like passage to this is that in the Gospel, that certain scribes, when they heard the Lord's words to the paralytic man, "Be of good cheer, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee," said within themselves, "This man blasphemeth." For how did they say within themselves, except by thinking? Then follows, and when Jesus saw their thoughts, he said, Why think ye evil in your thoughts? Matthew 9, 2-4. So far Matthew, but Luke narrates the same thing thus: the scribes and Pharisees began to think, saying, Who is this that speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he, answering, said unto them, What think ye in your hearts? Luke chapter 5, verse 21 and 22. That which in the book of wisdom is, they said, thinking, is the same herewith, they thought, saying. For both there and here it is declared that they spake within themselves and in their own heart, i.e., spake by thinking, for they spake within themselves, and it was said to them, What think ye? And the Lord himself says of that rich man whose ground brought forth plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying. Luke chapter 12, verse 17. Some thoughts then are speeches of the heart, wherein the Lord also shows that there is a mouth, when he says, Not that which entereth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which proceeds out of the mouth, that defileth a man. In one sentence he has comprised two diverse mouths of the man, one of the body, one of the heart. For assuredly that from which they thought the man to be defiled enters into the mouth of the body. But that from which the Lord said the man was defiled proceeds out of the mouth of the heart. So certainly he himself explained what he had said. For a little after he says also to his disciples concerning the same thing, Are ye also yet without understanding? Do ye not understand that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goeth into the belly, and is cast out into the draught? Here he most certainly pointed to the mouth of the body. But in that which follows he plainly speaks of the mouth of the heart, where he says, But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts. Matthew 15, 10-20. What is clearer than this explanation? And yet, when we call thoughts speeches of the heart, it does not follow that they are not also acts of sight, arising from the sight of knowledge, when they are true. For when these things are done outwardly by means of the body, then speech and sight are different things, but when we think inwardly, the two are one. Just as sight and hearing are two things mutually distinct in the bodily senses, but to see and hear are the same thing in the mind. And hence, while speech is not seen but rather heard outwardly, yet the inward species, i.e. thoughts, are said by the Holy Gospel to have been seen, not heard, by the Lord. They said within themselves, This man blasphemeth, says the Gospel, and then subjoined, And when Jesus saw their thoughts, therefore he saw what they said. For by his own thought he saw their thoughts, which they supposed no one saw but themselves. Whoever then is able to understand a word not only before it is uttered in sound, but also before the images of its sounds and are considered in thought. For this it is which belongs to no tongue, to wit, of those which are called the tongues of nations, of which our Latin tongue is one. Whoever, I say, is able to understand this is able now to see through this glass and in this enigma some likeness of that Word of whom it is said, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. St. John chapter 1 verse 1. For of necessity when we speak what is true, i.e. speak what we know, there is born from the knowledge itself which the memory retains, a word that is altogether of the same kind with that knowledge from which it is born. For the thought that is formed by the thing which we know is the word which we speak in the heart, which word is neither Greek nor Latin nor of any other tongue. But when it is needful to convey this to the knowledge of those to whom we speak, then some sign is assumed whereby to signify it. And generally a sound, sometimes a nod, is exhibited, the former to the ears, the latter to the eyes, that the word which we bear in our mind may become known also by bodily signs to the bodily senses. For what is to nod or beckon except to speak in some way to the sight? And Holy Scripture gives its testimony to this, for we read in the Gospel according to John, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked one upon another, doubting of whom he spake. Now there was leaning on Jesus' breast one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore beckons to him and says to him, Who is it of whom he speaks? John 13, verses 21 to 24. Here he spoke by beckoning what he did not venture to speak by sounds. But whereas we exhibit these and the like bodily signs either to ears or eyes of persons present to whom we speak, letters have been invented that we might be able to converse also with the absent, but these are signs of words, as words themselves are signs in our conversation of those things which we think.